Our presenter this evening is Nick Pope, an OUBS alumni. Nick founded and runs the London Networking Group, which meets every second Tuesday for an informal networking session. The next one is Tuesday the 8th of December, so if you are in and around London on that day, feel free to pop in. I will now hand you over to Nick, who will tell you a bit more about his background. So over to you, Nick.
Hello, good evening everybody. Probably the best thing is I will just run through, I'll go to the slide where I'll tell you a little bit about me. So, who am I? So I've spent over 25 years in the IT industry, across a number of different, a large range of sectors. I won't list them all. A lot of it has been spent the last few years in healthcare with some finance and government. I've been both a consultant, working for consultancies, as well as working as an employee for companies as an internal IT person. And for the last few years, I've actually been working as a freelance consultant or contractor, providing my skills in data migration in particular, but often other areas around data. So my experience has always been focused on data, designing databases, building reporting functionality in business intelligence suites and data warehouses. If I go to the next slide, just a quick run through some of the types of projects I've been involved in. So, for example, I spent 10 years working for a software company, and one of the things I did there was redesign the database, the way the data is structured, so that they can convert what was a tool for planning staff work for single offices. They could then make it a much larger and sophisticated piece of software, so you could plan across multiple offices and multiple territories and different time zones with many currencies. So, and the core of being able to do that is about understanding data. I've also put in data warehouses and BI reporting tools. For example, a tactical one I put in, it enables a company that was expanding at speed to move from getting reports that gave them little value and were always a month or 2 months post the end of a month, to they could actually start reporting the next day, and they could actually look at the information in many more ways than the original fixed reports they had. And as I said, the last 10 years I've been working specifically or more focused on data migration projects. I won't go into, I've listed a whole bunch of things under there which are fairly technical, and I think the key thing is it's both being able to talk to people in the business so they understand what's required, but also technical in that to be able to do a good job where you actually move data from the old system you're going to switch off into the new shiny system you're putting in place, that you actually do need to understand the data, how it's structured, how you need to manipulate it and clean it to get it in a good state for the new location you're putting it in. So, what is data? To start the main part of the presentation, I've put a brief definition. There are lots of definitions out there. So, data are distinct pieces of information. It can exist stored on paper, and that's traditionally where it would have been, or in a person's mind, or in electronic memory. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on data that's stored electronically. That's data that we can actually manipulate in computer systems and do a lot with. When it's on paper or in a person's mind, we're somewhat limited. Is data techie stuff? Some people may still think it is. In, say, the 1980s, where very few people in the business would have had a computer on their desk, there would have been the computer department that ran a big computer system, probably in a room you didn't really get access to. Then probably the only access to data that was captured electronically was via the big reports that would come out of the printers and be handed to you, and often those reports wouldn't be very easy to work your way through. And that's been changing since the 1980s with the introduction of things like Windows, putting desktops or machines or PCs on people's desks, and now people using laptops and tools that give you a much more, can present data in many more ways, you know, visually, through graphically, and things we're used to using all the time, such as spreadsheets, which allow us to manipulate data ourselves. And things are still moving on. So a lot of tools are becoming more user-friendly, and we're getting many more applications that people throughout the business can use to analyze data. So I would argue that actually data's not techie. We should all understand that the information you're working with as a business, the bit that's techie is perhaps the way, or the piece about how you process it. And with more user-friendly tools, you don't actually need to understand the techie bit. You just need to understand how it can be manipulated with that user-friendly tool. So I'm going to start with a poll. I think one thing, being someone that goes into organisations, and one of the first things I have to make sure people are clear on is, whose data is it? So in this poll, I'm asking you, who owns the data in your organisation? Is it A, the customers, B, the IT department, or C, the organisation?
We've got a few answers coming through, Nick. I don't know if you can see them. You should be able to see them. Most people seem to be saying C.
Well, they are correct. Sometimes it's people think that it's the IT department that own the data. And actually the IT department provides and manages the platforms and systems and tools to capture and store and process the data, but the business owns the data, it's their data. And I certainly, in my early days working in IT, I used to get somewhat annoyed with people in IT who thought they owned the data and they could control what the business could and couldn't do. I think most businesses these days, have much more power over what they can do with all the information that they've captured about their clients and sales, etc. And the important thing is often it's the people in the business who have a much greater insight into the customers that they're dealing with and what's happening. The IT people often aren't looking at it, and they're not looking at it in the same way. They're much more focused on managing the systems, making sure they're running, and helping to plan, putting in new systems. So there's a lot we can do with data, and the business should be driving that. It's one thing to note is there are laws and restrictions that do control and limit what you can do with data in terms of processing it and storing it and sharing it. In the UK, we have the Data Protection Act and a number of other regulations in place. There are new European regulations coming in which are going to unify it more across the whole of Europe as well. So it's important that you're aware of these things before you come up with some great ideas of what you're going to do with your data. So I'm going to have a look at the different types of data from a fairly high level. Most of the business data that we deal with is structured data in terms of the data we're processing and we analyze to make decisions. So structured data is usually stored in a relational database. That might be Oracle or SQL Server as probably the two best known ones that are out there at the moment. So it's structured and organized into fields or columns, files, stroke tables, different terminology depending on whether you're dealing with files or tables in a relational database. Don't worry about the terminology too much, but it's a very structured model as to how that data and all of the individual fields are organized. And that actually requires a lot of work to build up that design and that data model, so that then it's relatively easy to process, and it's a very formal organization of data. And the accessing of that data, probably less visible these days, is via SQL, which is structured query language. These days the tools are doing it all behind the scenes, so you don't actually see what's going on. The other type of data is unstructured data. And we're all dealing with a lot of this. Every document we create, spreadsheets to some extent, images, video, audio, social media posts, websites. These are all unstructured. There is a kind of an internal structure to them, but it's not organized in such a formal way as the structured data that we're gathering things like client data and sales data into. And often the unstructured information may be tagged and keyworded to provide some form of structure so we can organize it, much like a library system might organize books. There are things we can do with unstructured data. There are many tools out there that can analyze unstructured data. There are now clever things that can identify, for example, faces on images and things like that. Also, of course, there's data that's internal to your organization and data that's external. And most organizations, you'll be using both. Internal data is under the control of the organization or people within the organization. It may be stored on servers that sit within an office, in a data center, or more so these days, in a cloud. It might be a cloud that's actually run by the company, or an external cloud where it's managed by an external organization, but essentially it's still owned by your company or your organization. Then there's external data, which you and your organization don't control. These may be external websites, news organizations, information services, social media platforms, and many other things. Some you may use to provide you with information, such as getting credit scores. If you're taking on customers, it may be that you need to run a credit score before you can accept them as a customer. Share prices, for example, if you trade in shares, and other types of information such as that. Some organizations may also use external data to get insights into what customers or potential customers are saying about their products and services, such as looking into social media postings and online reviews. So those are the sort of two types of data, and where data might be, where it's internal data to your organization or external that your organization doesn't have control on. I think one thing that's a lot of interesting today, and there's a lot of talk about data all the time, is how fast is data growing? So there's a poll here we've set up. So how fast do you think the world's enterprise data is growing? Is it A, doubling every 6 years, B, doubling every 4 years, C, doubling every 2 years, or D, doubling every year?
Again, I'm not sure if you can see the results of that, Nick, but I think the majority are saying D, and there are a few C's. So that's interesting.
It is, and it's probably not something we're all fully aware of. We all know that it's increasing at a fair rate. So being at the C and D end is the right end. It is doubling very fast. Currently, it's doubling every 2 years. And this chart that I've put onto this slide actually shows you the growth that we're getting in data, particularly with the web and internet. And the volumes of data that are being produced is going up massively. So it's doubling every 2 years. You'll also notice this chart splits unstructured data out, or splits it into unstructured and structured data. And you'll notice that enterprise structured data is actually growing relatively slowly, whereas the unstructured data, and that's all things like Word documents, images, video, and documents, emails, etc., is growing at a massive rate, which probably isn't too surprising, although I have to admit it's quite scary, the amount of data that's being gathered all the time. Which takes us on to big data. So big data is a broad term, and there's lots of definitions for it. But it's all about large data sets that are a challenge to manipulate, manage, and process using traditional data processing applications. I'm not really going to talk much about big data. The concepts are much the same, but the applications to be able to analyze it are different, and the storage of it's more difficult because it requires more space. But I think the key thing is, over the last 20, 30 years, the volume of data has been increasing, and it's becoming more challenging to process. To some extent, the increase in computer processing power has been making it a little less of a challenge, but it's not keeping up with the growth in data. So there's potentially a whole topic on big data that could come out of here. But I think for most organizations, the key core data that most organizations are trying to manage is the actual structured data. That's the data in your sales system and customer systems, your financial systems. Unless, of course, you work for a company like Google, in which case you probably shouldn't be on this presentation, because you probably know a lot more and you're actually doing some very advanced things. So going back to the data that we're collecting and storing in most organizations, in fact in all organizations, there are kind of three categories we can collect that data, put that data into. Essentially, there's data that doesn't really change. It may change very occasionally, what I've called reference data here, which is fairly static. It does change. So things like currencies and countries, staff grades and departments. So there will be the occasional change to that, but generally it won't change more than once every, there might be 1 or 2 changes a year perhaps, often even less than that. Then the next set of data, it's kind of slower moving data, such as customer data. So that does change when customers change address, or their status changes. And then there's transactional data, and that's data that's changing every day. So if you're in share trading, then that's changing probably several times a minute. If you're selling books, then you're making sales all the time, but to an individual customer, maybe only a few times a month. So the examples I've got there are payments, orders, delivery status, insurance claims, and communications. And often it's the transactional data that's really of interest, but it's also how that relates to the customers. So analyzing this data that you capture is is the key. I think I double-clicked there. So how do we use the data that we're capturing? There are probably several levels at which data is used. So one of them is the operational level, which is the day-to-day capturing and dealing with the transactions that are going through the organization. That's sales to customers, and tracking any tasks and workflow that takes place to actually process orders or whatever it is your company or organization does. Then at the next level up, there's management, where there's a certain level of aggregation. So perhaps a team leader or a manager of a department will be looking across what's happening within their department. So they will have a certain amount of aggregation. They'll want to see, well, for my area, what sales have been going through, what's it looking like, and are there any exceptions, things that are going wrong or are taking longer than they should. And often that type of management reporting will be either weekly or monthly. And then at the top level, you'll have strategic views of what's happening in an organization. So that's a higher level of aggregation, looking perhaps over a longer time period, maybe drilling down into a bit of detail if there are things that look of interest. And that's very much looking at the data to make decisions about what the organization should be doing rather than managing a department on a daily, weekly or monthly basis. So we've got all these different levels of data that we're dealing with. We're looking at it at a low level and a high level. But I think one thing that I have to deal with all the time is actually, is the data right? Is it correct? So you can have all these reports that give you all the information you need, but actually you have to be certain that actually the data you've captured is correct and up to date. So the types of problems that you can have with data if you don't manage it properly is age. As data ages, it gets out of date. For example, customers move, or products are no longer available, or a service that you were once offering, you're no longer offering. And so it's very important that the data is kept up to date. And certainly one area that pretty much everywhere I go to is customer data is often out of date. We'll talk about what happens with that. Duplication, managing your data so that if a customer comes back, and I'm sure we've all been there, we've created an account on a website, we haven't been there for a while, we come back, we can't remember how to get in, we set up another account. And it's the same with organizations, not necessarily through a website, that a customer may have set up one type of account, perhaps a current bank account, and they may come back and they want to set up a mortgage account. And potentially you end up with two customer records where actually they should really ideally have one. And those types of problems can occur, and those duplicates can grow. And the other thing is accuracy. Accuracy of data. It's very easy for data to be entered inaccurately or be incomplete for a number of reasons. Sometimes the systems don't allow you to capture certain information fully, or it's been put in a rush and bits get miskeyed, mistyped, you get the wrong postcode. You get an address and it doesn't have some key information such as a house number. So all of these potentially can affect your reporting, all of these issues with your data. So this is what are the problems that these types of data issues can create for you. And these are not so much strategic things, but these are things you need to do just to manage your data. So when your data is not particularly well managed, or you've let it isn't looking after it fully, it can cause a lot of wasted money. A typical example is returned mail because customers moved or the details are incorrect or incomplete. Duplicated tasks such as multiple mailings where you've got multiple accounts for a person. Lost customers. You could potentially don't get a customer because they fail perhaps a credit check because the information or the data that's been put in is incorrect and it can't be matched, so they're not given the all clear to become a customer. And another area is called fines and investigations. So particularly with finance sector, it's very important that data is kept up to date and accurate and records are complete. So if you're a finance company, it's very important, for example, you manage the risk of customers. So you understand, based on the information you have and the credit checks you have about them and the history you have, every customer, big and small, will have a risk rating. And it's very important that banks manage their risk correctly. This, of course, is something that came to the front about 5 years ago, 6 years, 7 years ago, 2008. And not managing this can create some very big fines, which no doubt you've seen in the press. So going back, the organization owns the data. So it's very important that actually managing the data so that you can get accurate reporting is the responsibility of the business. So it's the responsibility of the business to ensure that the data is maintained correctly, it's kept up to date as much as is practically possible. And the IT department is there to provide the technical help to give you the tools and support to be able to do that, or they should be. Data will never be perfect, but it needs to be maintained so that at least you get an accurate view of what's happening in your business, and any reports you're producing are giving as accurate a view as possible. So of course every organization will be capturing lots of information. Some of the information will be structured information. So sort of the core areas that most organizations are looking to analyze are usually around transactions, that's sales, and that type of information. And attached to your sales, you'll have your customer information, you'll have information about, well, you'll be able to look at it by regions and stuff like that, but also you'll create lots of other information that will be published and available on your website, for example, where you may have video user guides, etc. But a lot of the internal information, such as your internal HR records and finance records, all of these are things that need to be kept up to date to be able to manage it and analyze it. So, coming up to another poll, I've only really talked about information, data, and how it's maintained. And now I'm interested to know, in this poll, where you think your organization is in terms of how effective it is at managing and be able to make decisions from data. So here we've got 5 choices. The first one being that your organization struggles to get reports out of the systems to be able to make any decisions. B, you have some basic reports, but they're limited, but they provide the information you need to make decisions. C is you have some fairly flexible reporting tools, which provide some useful information for decision making. D, you have some very powerful reporting tools, which gives a good insight to make strategic decisions. And then E is where you have very powerful reporting tools and you perform predictive analytics that not only allows you to make very good decisions, but gives your organization a competitive edge.
Nick, the consensus seems to be a mixture of B's and C's, which is not surprising, I don't think. So over to you.
Thank you, Janet. No, and that doesn't surprise me too much either. A lot of the organisations I go into, they're often struggling to get a handle on the data they've got. They've often been growing. They've been maybe they've been merging with other companies, and they're running multiple systems that do the same thing in parallel, but for different product ranges and etc. And certainly my experience, for example, in the banking world, the core system that a lot of the banking systems are working off is actually pretty old technology. Often it's 70s or 80s technology, sometimes 1990s technology, with a lot of new technology bolted on the sides. So there is, for a lot of organisations, there's a lot of room to be a bit more. I'm trying to think, creative and with how they use the data. So one thing I always often find myself doing, going into organisations and saying, well, you've captured all this data. So organisations collected all of data at individual customer level. They often have an ability to aggregate data. Sometimes you have a fixed set of reports. Some organisations will have more flexible reports that will allow you to aggregate and look at the transaction data from by a number of different attributes. An attribute being maybe analysed by country, city, age, socioeconomic group. Okay, probably less so for many. But going on to people like dunnhumby and the Tesco Club Card, they've certainly taken, back in 1994 when the Club Card was launched, they took and enabled the supermarket Tesco to analyse the data into great depth from all of these attributes I've listed above. They could even identify, if they didn't know, but generally that you had to put things like your gender and age, I think, when you applied for the card, but they could have identified or made a pretty accurate guess based on your spending behaviour. And as the then chairman of Tesco said, when he'd seen it in the process of launching the Club Card, is that it actually, from the data analysis they were doing from Club Card, from using the Club Card, is they were actually, the insights they had into customers was more than he'd ever been able to do in the previous 30 years working for Tesco's. So that's Tesco's is an example of where they started to really make use of the information they were gathering. All the other supermarkets at the same time were also gathering a lot of information about sales, but what they weren't doing was attaching it to people. They were just getting, we've sold this much product in this store, we need to order so much to fill the shelves again. And then moving into the digital world, or into the web, we have Amazon, who really have taken that idea further. Not only do they know your spending habits, they will also do a lot more personalized offers, which Tesco's were doing, but Amazon are taking that further. And they actually, the personalised offers are often based on other people's buying habits. That people who bought this were also interested in that. Although I have to admit that works for books, but if you go and buy a kettle, I've often found they then say, "Oh, if you like that kettle, why don't you buy this kettle too?" So I'm not convinced that they've got it 100% right, but it certainly prompted people like me to buy other books. So, and that's by essentially delving deeper into the data and analysing it and using that to drive more power out of their data. So how do you get more power out of your data? So if you're an organisation where you feel you're only getting relatively basic reports that give you some information about what's happening, but perhaps not as much information as you feel that you could get out of it, and not as much information that will give you a really good insight into patterns and that are happening, then some of these items you probably have a data warehouse. You probably have business intelligence tools, but a lot of it will be how you use those. So most organizations are often using them to a fairly limited, or in a fairly limited way. And then there are other tools that can give you further insights, such as data visualization tools, and then predictive analytics. So I'm going to take you briefly through these just to explain what they are from a fairly non-technical point of view. But I think the key thing to get more power out of your data is to be able to look at your data in other ways, or what I've called slice and dice it. So you can come up with an idea. Oh, I think this product sells better than that, or I want to see what's the history of that since we launched that new product, how have the sales been going, and how does that compare with that other product. Using these tools in the right way can give you that insight. So I'm sure you know, or you hear about data warehouses. So data warehouse really is a database specifically designed for reporting off and being able to look at data from lots of different angles. It's not your operational sales system, it's specifically for reporting. And often it's bringing data from lots of different systems. I've just shown that it's bringing in data from lots of different sales systems in different regions. It's also pulling in some product data and also some external data. It could be pulling in lots of other data too, but it's pulling in data that is going to give you the potential to understand the business and the sales much better. I'm talking about sales, but depending on your type of business, it might be other things too. So a data warehouse is a data store designed for reporting and analyzing data. As I've said, it brings data from many systems together to enable powerful reporting across a whole area of the business. And I've put in a tactical data warehouse just to show what it could do, how you could go from being an organization that struggled to get reports of much use to one where the directors and senior managers through the business could actually look at sales in a number of different ways at their desk up to the end of the previous day. Now, it's even getting to the point, a lot of organizations now where I'll actually be able to see that type of sales information maybe up to the previous hour. So, things are moving forwards. There's much more you can do. So business intelligence tools. So these are the reporting tools that would sit on top of your data warehouse. These are the tools that you would have on your desktop. Often when an organization puts in a business intelligence tool, there'll be some agreed standard reports that will sit there that people can run. But really, those are useful, but where the real power comes in is where you can start to build your own reports, where people in the business can write their own reports. They can come up with questions they may have about the data and the sales, and they can build a report that will actually allow them to look at it in that way. And the ability a lot of business intelligence have is to produce graphical reports. And as soon as you start to use graphics and the ability to drill down through graphical representations of the data, it can help you to visualize things, because a big sheet with numbers on it can be quite difficult to digest and get your head around, whereas as soon as you see things graphically, it can certainly make things much more clear. Which takes us on to data visualization tools, and you could argue there is data visualization in a lot of business intelligence tools, but there are a lot of other data visualization tools out there that allow you to present data in many different ways, and how you want to present information really depends on the type of business you're in and the type of information you're trying to get out of it. I've just taken a couple of shots of a couple of websites. There's one which is it's actually a data visualization tool. It's the one in the background with the UK retail numbers. That's probably pretty close to BI tools as you're currently using them. The geographical one, we're starting to get into a realm where you're using, it's a great way of understanding perhaps customers and spread of customers. You could analyze different types of products and which ones are selling where. You can start to get more graphical representations where perhaps you add bars coming out of that as well, so you get another dimension into it. But there are a lot of tools out there that can really allow you to look and analyze data. It's also a great way of presenting data to other people, because presenting a spreadsheet, a grid of numbers, is often not that great, but using visualization tools in the right way can help you to understand, but also to present to other people the information that you're getting out of your data. Moving on, predictive analytics. So what a lot of organizations are trying to do is not just understand what's been happening, but trying to predict what will happen. Now, the predictive analytics that organizations are doing, often I think what I hear is a lot of people feel it's not always quite delivering what perhaps the salesman said it would, but it can give great insights. And to some extent, organizations have been doing and using predictive analytics for a long time. So supermarkets, for example, have been using predictive analytics, using information based on things like weather reports and knowing what happens at particular seasons, or that a weekend or bank holiday weekends coming up. Based on previous experience, they have a good idea of how that's going to affect sales. So if it's in the middle of the summer and they know it's going to be a hot and sunny weekend, they know their ice cream sales are going to go up. And the same for clothing companies. There are certain things that will affect their sales based on what time of the year it is, what the weather's going to be like. Predictive analytics tries to take this further by using statistical techniques and predictive modeling. So it's trying to model how things are going to be based on what they know about what's happened before. But it can give quite fairly good results and help to ensure that your shelves or your racks are filled, if you're in the retail business, for example, with the right product, and that you're delivering the product at the right time. And extending the types of information that people are using for predictive analytics. Some organizations, some companies are starting to, rather than just looking at internal data, they're starting to tap into external data. That might be data that's on social media and other things. So I think I've ended up booking a holiday because I made a comment on social media, because that organisation actually saw what I tweeted, and because they responded to it, I ended up contacting them. So it's not that's probably not quite the example I was particularly looking for, but also just seeing what people are talking about in the public space can be used to feed into the predictive analytics. So a lot of the getting a competitive edge is really doing things better than your competitors. So you don't have to be going all the way down to predictive analytics to be have a competitive edge over your competitors. It's about, are you using your data in a more sophisticated way than your competitors. So we're really coming to the end, and there's a lot more that you could go into about using your data more strategically. So here I've got a kind of flow of, what are the things you need to do to be more to enable you to use your data more strategically. The first thing is get to know your data better, and really to be able to do that, you need someone who understands the technical side of data, but also the business. So that's either a business person working with someone who is more technical, who understands with very much a data focus, and can help play around and analyze your data. And also discussing with them, that the one thing is understanding you can often do a lot more with your data. What is it you can do more? Because often I've gone into places going, oh, we've just been told we can't do that. The IT department says that's not possible. And I've gone in and said, well, no, I think they're not saying it's not possible. It's they don't want to do it. They think the costs are going to be too much, but they haven't given you a full response. The answer is yes, it's possible. It may take time. It may take money. So the first point, you need to get to know your data better. If you want to be able to produce accurate reporting, you need to fix data problems and fill gaps. And one area that you often find is if you've got a lot of data that you've collected a long time ago, it's probably got gaps because you didn't originally capture a particular piece of data, but now perhaps you are capturing that piece of data. So, for example, well, a good example is probably the collection of email addresses for customers. 10 years ago, you probably didn't capture it, but now you probably do, and it may be you haven't gone back and collected that information about your customers. But actually, if you're now doing more communication via email and trying to push communication with customers through email, you need to capture that information to enable you to do that. And the more you communicate with customers electronically, the more you can actually reduce communication costs and communicate quicker. But of course, there's improving tools to investigate and analyze your data. So that's using tools you've already got better, enabling the functionality in it to be more sophisticated. So there's a lot you can do with what you already have. Sometimes that may just require you sometimes getting someone involved to show you what help work with someone with the technical expertise to show you what can be done with the data you have. And that needs to be a data, I would call them a data expert, someone who understands data and how to manipulate it in a way that's useful for you in the business to analyze and look at it. That's playing around with your data and looking at it in different ways uncovers a lot of things, and perhaps gives you ideas. Oh, I want to investigate that, which is identifying the patterns. And sometimes you think, oh, it looks like we had a sales peak because of an event or because of a marketing piece you did. Going around identifying things that look like a pattern and testing that by looking at the data, it can be quite a useful thing, and can often take you to actually coming up with new reports that will actually give you more insight into your data. Then there's other data that your organization is probably collecting, and external data. So if you can draw on that data, such as information that's collected on your website, if that's used perhaps as a potential sales route, you may be able to join that up with your actual sales data and customer data. Or it may be other areas of data you can actually start to join up, which could potentially give you a better picture and give you more insight into customer behavior, sales. Perhaps people are visiting your website a lot and it's turning into sales, but if you can start to track that, some organizations do, some probably, a lot of them aren't tracking that type of information and linking it all the way through and understanding customer behaviors.
Nick, Evelyn has asked, what kind of tools and programs can you use?
It's a good question. So I often go into an organization and I have to use whatever they have. So I'm often using personally I often have to use fairly basic tools. So for example, Excel spreadsheets are often my first port of call. You may require, if you can set up reports with the business intelligence tools you have in place, but you have fairly limited or fixed formats that the reports come out in, if you can export those into a spreadsheet, it may be that you can slice and dice and adjust the way you're looking at it through that. Otherwise, you may need to work with someone in your IT department or an IT person to pull out the data into a format that you can then use within a spreadsheet to analyze. That would be my first thing. I'm used to working with fairly basic tools. Then, of course, if you don't have business intelligence tools, there are lots of them out there. I'm now struggling to actually name some, but I probably shouldn't say Oracle Discoverer, because actually I believe that's actually going to go out of service, and there are lots of other ones that are better. One beginning with I, name's gone, but there are lots of other players in the market who produce business intelligence tools. If you go onto Google and just put in business intelligence tools, you'll get a whole list. There's a lot of small companies and big well-known companies producing them.
Thank you, Nick. And Frida has asked, can you give examples of drawing on social media data?
There are some interesting examples that you'll see quite a lot of companies out there who actually do use their social media. Now, how they use it, they may not be all linking it up necessarily with things like their sales data, but I know, for example, there was some healthcare planning where they were deciding where to put the where to deliver their flu jabs to, and they actually were using social media and the geographic location of the people actually posting to decide the priorities on where they should actually be delivering those flu jabs, so that they were in the right part of the world, or right part of the country. There are lots of other ways. I could probably come up with more, but that's one particular one in the healthcare sector.
Thank you, Nick. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up a bit. We've already gone over time, and thank you everyone for staying tonight. I found it very, very interesting because obviously in the OU we deal with a lot of data, so it is very, very useful to me. So thank you, Nick.
It's a pleasure. Well, thankfully that was the last slide.
Sorry, yes, I am rushing you. I do apologise. Okay. So I'd just like to say to everyone, enjoy the rest of your evenings, everybody, and thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.